The wind howled like a chorus of wolves, as Willa Zimmerman urged her exhausted mare forward through drifts that reached past the horse's knees. Each labored breath from both woman and beast, hanging crystallized in the frigid January air of 1885. She had been a fool to think she could make it from Springerville to St. John's before the storm hit. But desperation had a way of clouding judgment, and the telegram about her aunt's failing health had sent her rushing northward from Tucson without proper preparation. Now the world had become an endless expanse of white fury, the trail completely obliterated, and Willa could barely feel her fingers despite the thick gloves she wore. Her mare stumbled, nearly going down, and Willa knew with terrible certainty that they would not survive the night out here in the open. Through the driving snow, a faint light flickered in the distance, appearing and disappearing like a phantom as the wind whipped curtains of white between Willa and what she prayed was salvation. She turned the mare toward it, leaning low over the animal's neck, murmuring encouragements that were snatched away by the wind. The light grew stronger, resolving into the warm glow of windows, and then suddenly there were structures around her. A barn, a corral, a sturdy ranch house built low against the Wyoming winter. Willa slid from the saddle, her legs nearly buckling, and staggered toward the front door. She raised her fist to knock, but her strength failed her, and she collapsed against the wooden planks, her knock more of a desperate scraping sound. The door opened so suddenly that she fell forward into warmth and light and the solid chest of a man who caught her with strong hands. "Good God!" a deep voice rumbled above her, and then she was being lifted, carried inside, the door kicked shut behind them against the shrieking wind. "You are half frozen to death." Willa tried to speak, but her jaw would not cooperate, her teeth chattering so violently she bit her tongue. She was aware of being set down in a chair near a roaring fire, of hands working at the buttons of her coat with surprising gentleness, of a heavy blanket being wrapped around her shoulders. "Your horse," she finally managed to force out through stiff lips. "I will see to it," the man said, and she got her first clear look at him. He was tall and broad-shouldered, perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes the color of storm clouds. His face was weathered and lined in a way that spoke of years spent outdoors, but there was a kindness in his expression that made something in Willa's chest tighten. "Stay by the fire. Do not move." He pulled on a heavy coat and disappeared back into the storm. Willa huddled in the chair, feeling sensation return to her extremities in painful prickles. The room around her was simple but well kept, with sturdy furniture and shelves lined with books. A pot hung over the fire, and the smell of beef stew made her stomach clench with hunger. She had not eaten since dawn, and it was now well past dark. The door opened again, bringing a swirl of snow and the man, who stamped his boots and shook ice from his coat. "Your mare is in the barn with hay and water," he reported, moving to the fire to warm his hands. "She will be fine once she warms up, as will you, I hope." "Thank you," Willa said, her voice steadier now. "I would have died out there." "Yes," he agreed bluntly, meeting her eyes. "You would have." He studied her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression, a flash of wonder quickly hidden. "I am Daniel Hayes. This is my ranch, such as it is. Willa Zimmerman." She pulled the blanket tighter around herself. "I was trying to reach St. John's. My aunt is ill." "You came from Springerville in this." Daniel shook his head. "That was foolish. I know that now." Willa felt defensive heat rise in her cheeks. "The storm came up faster than I expected." Daniel moved to the pot over the fire, ladling stew into 2 bowls. "When did you last eat?" "This morning." He handed her a bowl and a spoon, along with a thick slice of bread. "Eat. You need to get your strength back. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the howling of the wind outside. Willa watched Daniel covertly over the rim of her bowl. He had a strong profile, a firm jaw shadowed with stubble, and capable hands that handled the rough earthenware with easy confidence. There was something about him that spoke of solitude, a quality she recognized because she saw it in herself. "How long have you lived here?" she asked finally. "5 years. Daniel set his empty bowl aside and leaned back in his chair, his long legs stretched toward the fire. "I bought this land after I left the cavalry. It is isolated, but that is what I wanted. No wife, no family." Something shuddered in his expression. "No, just me and the cattle and horses, and the occasional fool traveler who gets caught in a blizzard." Willa bristled at being called a fool again, even though she knew he was right. "I suppose you never make mistakes." "I make them." Daniel's voice was quiet. "I just try not to make the kind that will kill me." The rebuke was gentle but pointed, and Willa felt her irritation fade into chagrin. "You are right. I am sorry. I was reckless and you saved my life. I am grateful, truly." Daniel looked at her then, really looked at her, and Willa felt the intensity of that gaze like a physical touch. His eyes traveled over her face, taking in her features with an attention that made her pulse quicken. She knew she was not beautiful in the conventional sense, her face too angular, her mouth too wide, her dark hair too wild even when properly pinned. But something in Daniel's expression made her feel as though she were being seen, truly seen, for the first time in her life. "I have been waiting my whole life," he said suddenly, softly, and then seemed startled by his own words. He stood abruptly, turning away. "You should rest. The storm will blow itself out by morning, and then I can take you to St. John's if the roads are passable." "What did you mean?" Willa asked, setting aside her empty bowl and standing as well, though her legs still felt shaky. "What have you been waiting for?" Daniel kept his back to her, his shoulders tense. "Nothing. I spoke without thinking. You can sleep in my room. I will take the chair out here." "I cannot take your bed." "You can and you will." He finally turned, and the look on his face was almost fierce. "You have been half frozen and exhausted. You need proper rest. Do not argue with me about this." Willa wanted to argue, but the truth was she could barely stand. The warmth and food had made her realize just how bone-deep her exhaustion went. "Thank you," she said quietly. Daniel showed her to a small bedroom that was as simply furnished as the main room, with a sturdy bed covered in quilts and a washstand in the corner. "There is water in the pitcher," he said, not quite meeting her eyes now. "Call out if you need anything." After he left, closing the door softly behind him, Willa sank onto the edge of the bed and covered her face with her hands. Her heart was beating too fast, her thoughts a confused tangle. She kept hearing Daniel's words, the quiet intensity of them. "I have been waiting my whole life." What had he meant? And why did those words make her feel as though something fundamental had shifted in the world? She washed her face and hands in the cold water from the pitcher, then crawled under the quilts fully clothed, too tired to do more. But despite her exhaustion, sleep was slow to come. She lay in the darkness, listening to the storm rage outside and thinking about the man in the next room, the loneliness in his eyes, the gentleness of his hands as he had wrapped the blanket around her. She was still thinking about him when she finally drifted off. Willa woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee. For a moment she was disoriented, unable to remember where she was, and then it all came rushing back. The storm, the desperate ride, Daniel Hayes catching her as she fell through his door. She sat up quickly, pushing her tangled hair back from her face, and realized she had slept in her clothes. She must look a fright. There was a knock at the door. "Miss Zimmerman, are you awake?" "Yes," Willa called, swinging her legs out of bed. Her body ached in a dozen places, muscles stiff from the cold and the hard ride, but she felt immeasurably better than she had the night before. "Coffee is ready when you are," Daniel said through the door, "and I have biscuits and bacon." Willa did what she could to make herself presentable, smoothing her dress and rebraiding her hair, then ventured out into the main room. Bright morning light flooded through the windows, and she could see that the storm had indeed blown itself out. Snow lay in deep drifts everywhere, transforming the landscape into a study in white and shadow. Daniel stood at the stove, and he turned when he heard her approach. In the daylight, he looked younger than she had thought last night, and even more handsome, though his face still bore that quality of solitude that intrigued her. He had shaved and changed his shirt, and she caught herself staring at the way his suspenders framed his broad shoulders. "Good morning," he said, and there was something almost shy in his manner that had not been there the night before. "How are you feeling?" "Much better, thanks to you." Willa accepted the cup of coffee he poured for her, wrapping her hands around the warm tin. "The storm is over." "Yes." "It blew through fast, which is good for you, bad for me." At her questioning look, he explained, "I have cattle scattered over several hundred acres. I will need to ride out and check on them, make sure none are trapped in drifts or injured." "I see." Willa felt a stab of disappointment. She had assumed he would take her to St. John's right away, but of course his own work had to come first. "How long will that take?" "Most of the day." Daniel set a plate of food in front of her. "I am sorry. I know you are anxious about your aunt. But if I do not check the herd, I could lose animals, and I cannot afford that." "No, of course not. I understand." Willa did understand, even as worry about Aunt Margaret gnawed at her. "Perhaps I could ride out on my own, if you could point me in the right direction." Daniel looked at her as though she had suggested flying to the moon. "Absolutely not. The drifts are 6 feet deep in places. You could ride right off the trail and not know it until you and your horse went down. Besides which, your mare needs another day of rest before she will be fit to travel." He was right, of course, but that did not make the waiting any easier. Willa picked at her breakfast, her appetite diminished by anxiety. "Tell me about your aunt," Daniel said, settling into the chair across from her with his own plate. "You are close to her." "She raised me after my parents died." Willa felt the familiar ache in her chest. "I was 8 when the fever took them. Aunt Margaret was my father's sister. She never married, never had children of her own, but she took me in without hesitation and loved me as though I were her own daughter." "Where does she live?" "St. John's. She has a small house there, takes in sewing to support herself." Willa stared down at her coffee. "The telegram said she had taken a fall and could not get up. The neighbors found her and sent for the doctor, but I do not know more than that. I have been working in Tucson at a dress shop, but I came as soon as I received word." "Alone?" Daniel's voice carried a note of concern. "That is a hard journey for a woman traveling by herself." "I can take care of myself." Willa heard the defensive edge in her own voice and tried to soften it. "I have been on my own for a while now. Aunt Margaret is getting older, and I needed to earn my own way rather than be a burden to her." "I am sure you were never a burden." The kindness in his tone made Willa's eyes sting unexpectedly. She blinked hard, looking away. She would say the same thing. "But I am 22 years old. I should be able to stand on my own feet." They finished breakfast in companionable silence, and then Daniel rose and began gathering supplies. "I need to head out," he said, buckling on a gun belt and shrugging into a heavy coat. "Make yourself at home. There is food in the pantry if you get hungry, and plenty of wood for the fire. I should be back by late afternoon." "Be careful," Willa said, and was surprised by how much she meant it. Daniel paused at the door and looked back at her, and again she saw that flash of something in his eyes, an intensity that made her breath catch. "I will," he said quietly. "I have something to come back to now." Before Willa could ask what he meant, he was gone, the door closing behind him. She stood frozen, her heart pounding, replaying his words in her mind. "I have something to come back to now." He could not mean her. He barely knew her, and yet the way he had looked at her made her feel as though he saw straight into her soul. Willa spent the day trying to keep herself occupied. She tidied the cabin, washed the breakfast dishes, added wood to the fire. She explored the bookshelf and found a surprising collection, everything from dime novels to Shakespeare to agricultural journals. She pulled down a volume of poetry and tried to read, but the words would not hold her attention. Her thoughts kept drifting to Daniel, to the way he had caught her when she fell, the gentleness of his hands, the kindness in his eyes, the loneliness. She recognized that loneliness because it was her own. She had spent the past 4 years trying to build a life for herself in Tucson, working long hours at the dress shop, living in a tiny room above a bakery. She had made a few friends, but no close ones. There had been men who expressed interest, but none who made her feel anything more than mild curiosity. She had begun to wonder if there was something wrong with her, some essential piece missing that would allow her to form the kind of connections other people seemed to make so easily. But last night, when Daniel Hayes had looked at her with those storm-gray eyes and said he had been waiting his whole life, she had felt something wake up inside her, something she had thought might not exist at all. The afternoon dragged on. Willa made herself a simple lunch and paced the cabin, going to the window every few minutes to look out across the snow-covered land. The sun was brilliant on the white expanse, making her squint. She could see nothing moving anywhere, no sign of Daniel or his cattle. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the snow pink and gold, Willa heard the sound of a horse approaching. She hurried to the door and pulled it open to see Daniel riding up on a big bay gelding. He looked exhausted, his face reddened by wind and cold, ice clinging to his coat and hat. "Are you all right?" Willa called, and he nodded, dismounting stiffly. "Cold and tired, but fine. The cattle are mostly all right, lost 2 calves, but that is better than it could have been." He led the horse toward the barn, and Willa followed, pulling her shawl tight against the cold. "Can I help?" Daniel glanced at her in surprise. "You do not have to. I want to." So she held the lantern while Daniel unsaddled the bay and rubbed him down, the warm animal smell of horse filling the barn. The cow and her mare stood in adjacent stalls, both looking content with their hay. Daniel worked with economical movements, clearly familiar with every aspect of the task, and Willa found herself watching the play of muscles under his shirt, the competent way he handled the equipment. "You are staring," Daniel said without looking up, and Willa felt heat flood her face. "I am sorry. I was just thinking that you are very good at this. I should be. I have been doing it for years." He finished with the horse and straightened, brushing hay from his shirt. In the dim light of the barn, with shadows playing across his face, he looked both rugged and gentle, and Willa felt her heart do a strange little skip in her chest. "Thank you for letting me stay," she said softly. "For taking me in last night, for not making me feel like a burden today." Daniel stepped closer, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Willa," he said, and the way he said her name, soft and almost reverent, made her shiver. "You could never be a burden. When you fell through that door last night, it was like something I did not even know I had been praying for had finally been answered." "Daniel," her voice came out as barely a whisper, "you do not even know me. I know enough." His hand came up as though he might touch her face, but he stopped himself, letting it fall back to his side. "I know that you are brave and determined. I know that you love your aunt enough to risk your life for her. I know that when I look at you, I feel something I have never felt before." "What do you feel?" Willa asked, hardly daring to breathe. "Like I've been asleep my whole life and just woke up." Daniel's eyes searched hers. "Like maybe I am not meant to be alone after all." Willa reached out and took his hand, feeling calluses and strength and warmth. "I feel it too," she whispered. "I do not understand it. We just met. But I feel it too." Daniel's fingers curled around hers, and they stood there in the quiet barn with the horses shifting and breathing around them, holding hands like children and looking at each other with wonder. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat and stepped back, though he did not quite let go of her hand. "We should go inside. You will freeze out here." They walked back to the cabin together, still holding hands, and Willa felt something settle in her chest, a sense of rightness she had never experienced before. Daniel made dinner while she set the table, and they worked around each other with an ease that should have been impossible after less than a day of acquaintance. They talked while they ate, sharing stories about their lives. Daniel told her about growing up in Missouri, about joining the cavalry at 18 and spending 6 years fighting in skirmishes with various Indian tribes before growing disillusioned with the violence and the politics. "I wanted peace," he said, staring into the fire. "I wanted a place where I could work with my hands and watch things grow instead of watching them die. So I took my saved pay and came out here and bought this land. It has been hard work and lonely, but it has been mine." "Do you regret it?" Willa asked. "Not until last night." She looked at him in confusion. "What do you mean?" Daniel met her eyes. "Last night I realized what was missing, not the ranch, not the isolation, but someone to share it with, someone to build a life with." He paused. "I know this is mad, I know I sound like a fool. But Willa, when you fell through that door, it was like the universe had answered a question I did not even know I was asking." Willa felt tears prick her eyes. "I have felt so alone," she said quietly. "For so long, I have felt like I was just going through the motions of living without really being alive. And then I met you, and everything suddenly feels different, sharper, more real." "Stay," Daniel said suddenly, urgently. "After you see your aunt, after you make sure she is all right, come back. Stay with me." "Daniel, I cannot just stay. We barely know each other. People would talk. It would not be proper." "Then marry me." The words hung in the air between them, huge and impossible and terrifying and perfect. Willa stared at him, her heart hammering. "You cannot be serious." "I have never been more serious about anything in my life." Daniel leaned forward, taking both her hands in his. "I know it is fast, I know it is mad, but Willa, I am 30 years old and I have never felt this way about anyone. I spent 6 years in the cavalry surrounded by men, and then 5 years alone on this ranch. I have met plenty of women in that time, women who were beautiful and kind and perfectly suitable. And I felt nothing, not even a spark. But you walk through my door and it is like lightning struck me. Like I have been stumbling around in the dark and someone finally lit a lamp." "I feel the same way," Willa whispered. "But marriage, that is forever. I know, that is what I want, forever with you." Willa looked down at their joined hands, her thoughts whirling. This was insane. She had known this man for barely 24 hours. She should say no, should insist on getting to know him properly, on taking time to be sure. But when had taking her time ever led her to happiness? She had been careful and sensible her whole life, and where had it gotten her? Working long hours for poor pay in a city where she had no real connections, coming home every night to an empty room, wondering if this was all there was. "Yes," she said, looking up to meet Daniel's eyes. "Yes, I will marry you." The joy that spread across Daniel's face was like watching the sun rise. He pulled her to her feet and into his arms, holding her tight against his chest, and Willa wrapped her arms around him and held on, feeling his heart beating against hers. They stood like that for a long moment, And then Daniel pulled back just enough to cup her face in his hands. "May I kiss you?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes," Willa breathed, and then his mouth was on hers, gentle at first and then deeper, and she felt that lightning he had spoken of, a shock of connection that ran through her entire body. She had been kissed before, fumbling attempts by boys who did not interest her, but this was different. This was like coming home. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. "Tomorrow we will go to St. John's," he said. "We will make sure your aunt is all right, and then we will find a preacher and get married, if that is still what you want." "It is what I want," Willa said firmly. "It is the only thing I am sure of." They stayed up late into the night, sitting by the fire and talking, learning everything they could about each other. Willa told him about growing up with Aunt Margaret, about learning to sew and discovering she had a talent for it, about the quiet satisfaction of creating beautiful things with her hands. Daniel told her about his parents, both dead now, and his younger sister who had married a banker and lived in St. Louis, and how he had always felt like he did not quite fit anywhere until he came here. "I think maybe I was waiting for you," he said, brushing a strand of hair back from Willa's face. "Maybe I needed to be here so you would know where to find me." "Through a blizzard," Willa said with a smile. "Very dramatic. You are worth 1,000 blizzards." They kissed again, and finally, reluctantly parted to sleep. Daniel in his chair by the fire and Willa in his bed. But Willa lay awake for a long time, her lips still tingling, her heart still racing, hardly able to believe that her life had changed so completely in the space of a single day. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the sky a brilliant blue. Daniel saddled both horses while Willa packed what few belongings she had. The ride to St. John's took several hours, the horses picking their way carefully through the deep snow, but the trail was passable. They talked the whole way, Daniel pointing out landmarks and telling her stories about the area, Willa sharing her memories of visiting Aunt Margaret over the years. St. John's was a small town, just a scattering of buildings along the main street, but it looked welcoming in the bright sunshine. Daniel helped Willa down from her horse in front of a neat little house with blue shutters, and Willa felt her anxiety return in a rush. What would she find inside? How bad was Aunt Margaret's injury? She knocked, and a middle-aged woman opened the door. "You must be Willa," she said warmly. "Your aunt has been asking for you. I am Mrs. Patterson from next door. I have been looking after her." "How is she?" Willa asked as she hurried inside, Daniel close behind her. "Better than we feared. The doctor says she broke her hip in the fall, but she is healing well. She just needs time and rest." Aunt Margaret was propped up in bed, her silver hair braided over one shoulder, and when she saw Willa, her face lit up with joy. "My dear girl, you came so quickly." Willa rushed to her side, taking her aunt's hands. "Of course I came. I was so worried." "I am all right, truly. Just a silly old woman who missed a step." Aunt Margaret's sharp eyes moved past Willa to where Daniel stood in the doorway. "And who is this fine young man?" Willa felt her cheeks heat. "This is Daniel Hayes. He saved my life. I was caught in the storm 2 nights ago and would have frozen to death if he had not taken me in." "Then, I owe you a great debt, Mr. Hayes," Aunt Margaret said, studying Daniel with an intensity that made Willa nervous. "Please come in. Do not stand there like a stranger." Daniel removed his hat and approached the bed, and something in his manner must have impressed Aunt Margaret because she smiled. "You have kind eyes," she said. "That is important in a man." "Thank you, madam," Daniel said gravely. "Aunt Margaret," Willa said, taking a deep breath. "There is something I need to tell you. Daniel and I are going to be married." There was a long silence. Mrs. Patterson, who had been tidying the room, stopped and stared. Aunt Margaret's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. "Married," she repeated. "And how long have you known Mr. Hayes?" 2 days, Willa admitted. "I know it sounds mad, but Aunt Margaret, I have never been more sure of anything. Daniel is a good man and I love him." Aunt Margaret looked from Willa to Daniel and back again, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Hayes, would you give me a moment alone with my niece?" "Of course." Daniel squeezed Willa's shoulder gently and left the room, Mrs. Patterson following him. As soon as they were alone, Aunt Margaret reached out and took Willa's hand. "Tell me," she said simply. So Willa told her everything, the words spilling out in a rush. She told her about the storm and collapsing on Daniel's doorstep, about the way he had cared for her, about the connection she had felt from the first moment. She told her about the loneliness she had been carrying for so long and how it had vanished the moment Daniel looked at her. "I know it is fast," Willa said. "I know people will think I am being reckless, but Aunt Margaret, you always told me to trust my instincts. My instincts are telling me that Daniel is the man I am meant to spend my life with." Aunt Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her thumb rubbing over Willa's knuckles. "Your mother," she finally said, "met your father on a Tuesday and married him on Saturday. Everyone said she was mad. I thought she was mad. But they had 15 years of the happiest marriage I have ever witnessed before the fever took them." She smiled, her eyes bright with tears. "You have your mother's heart, Willa, big and brave and ready to love with everything you have. If you are sure about this young man, then I am sure too." Willa felt tears spill down her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for understanding. Bring him back in. I want to talk to him." Willa fetched Daniel, who returned looking slightly nervous. Aunt Margaret crooked her finger at him and he approached the bed. "Mr. Hayes, my niece tells me you want to marry her." "Yes, madam, more than anything." "Why?" Daniel did not hesitate. "Because she is brave and kind and beautiful, and because when I look at her, I see my whole future. Because I have been alone for a long time, and I do not want to be alone anymore. And because I think maybe I was meant to be here in this place at this time so that when she needed help, I would be the one to give it." Aunt Margaret nodded slowly. "And you will be good to her. You will cherish her and protect her and build a good life with her." "I will spend every day of my life trying to make her happy," Daniel said quietly. "That is my promise to you. Then you have my blessing." Aunt Margaret held out her hand and Daniel took it carefully. "But know this, young man. Willa is the most precious thing in the world to me. If you hurt her, you will answer to me, broken hip or no broken hip." Daniel's lips twitched. "Understood, madam." They were married 3 days later in the small church at the edge of town. Aunt Margaret insisted on being there despite her injury, so Daniel borrowed a wagon and made a bed in the back so she could attend without having to sit up. Mrs. Patterson came, and several of Aunt Margaret's other neighbors, curious about the whirlwind romance. The preacher was an elderly man with a gentle face who seemed charmed by their story. Willa wore her best dress, a deep blue wool that brought out her eyes, and Daniel had somehow procured a new shirt and string tie. They stood before the preacher holding hands, and when it came time for the vows, Daniel's voice was strong and sure, and Willa's did not waver. She looked into his gray eyes and saw her whole future there, and it was bright and full of possibility. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Daniel kissed her softly, sweetly, and the small gathering applauded. Willa felt joy bubble up inside her like champagne, effervescent and intoxicating. She was married. She was Mrs. Daniel Hayes. She had a home and a husband and a future. They stayed in St. John's for another week, so Willa could help care for Aunt Margaret and make sure she was truly on the mend. Daniel proved himself during that time, doing all manner of chores around the house, fetching supplies, even sitting with Aunt Margaret and reading to her when Willa needed to rest. By the time they prepared to leave, Aunt Margaret was clearly smitten with her new nephew. "You take care of each other," she said, holding Willa tight. "And write to me. I want to hear all about your life on that ranch." "I will write every week," Willa promised, "and you will come stay with us as soon as you are well enough to travel. I will hold you to that." The ride back to Daniel's ranch felt different than the ride away from it. Willa was riding toward home now, not away from it. The landscape that had seemed so desolate and frightening during the storm now looked beautiful. All that white snow sparkling under the sun, the distant mountains rising purple against the sky. When they finally crested the rise and Willa could see the ranch buildings below, she felt a surge of belonging so strong it almost frightened her. This was hers now. This was home. Daniel helped her down from her horse and pulled her close, kissing her deeply. "Welcome home, Mrs. Hayes," he murmured against her lips. "It feels right," Willa said, looking up at the house. "It feels like I have always belonged here." That night, in the privacy of their bedroom, Daniel made love to her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. He treated her like she was precious, something to be cherished, and Willa gave herself to him completely, holding nothing back. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the quilts, and Willa traced patterns on Daniel's chest while he stroked her hair. "Are you happy?" he asked softly. "Happier than I ever thought I could be," Willa answered honestly. "Are you?" "I did not know happiness could feel like this, like my heart is too full to fit in my chest." The weeks that followed were an adjustment as they learned to live together, to navigate the rhythms of ranch life and marriage. Willa learned to care for the chickens Daniel kept for eggs, to milk the cow, to help with the endless chores that came with running a ranch. Daniel taught her to ride better, to read the weather, to understand the cattle. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and read together, or Daniel would play his harmonica while Willa sewed, or they would simply talk, sharing their thoughts and dreams. There were difficult moments, of course. Times when they disagreed or got on each other's nerves, when the isolation felt oppressive, when the work seemed endless. But they learned to talk through their problems, to apologize when they were wrong, to support each other when things were hard. And always, underlying everything, was that deep connection they had felt from the first moment, a bond that only grew stronger with time. Winter gave way to spring and the land transformed. Snow melted to reveal green grass, wildflowers bloomed in riotous color, and the cattle Daniel had worried over through the winter dropped healthy calves. Willa planted a garden behind the house, putting in vegetables and herbs, and she felt a deep satisfaction watching things grow. One evening in late May, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold, Willa took Daniel's hand and placed it on her stomach. "I am with child," she said quietly. Daniel's eyes went wide, his hand spreading protectively over her belly. "Truly, truly. The baby should come in December." For a moment, Daniel could not speak. Then he pulled Willa into his arms and held her, and she felt wetness on her neck and realized he was crying. "I thought I would be alone forever," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And now I have you, and soon I will have a child. I do not know what I did to deserve this much happiness." "You opened your door," Willa said, tears streaming down her own face now. "When the storm brought me to you, you opened your door and let me in. That is all it took." The pregnancy was not easy. Willa was sick for the first few months, barely able to keep food down, and Daniel worried over her constantly. But as summer progressed and her belly grew round, she felt better, blooming with health and vitality. Daniel treated her like she was made of glass, refusing to let her do any heavy work, and Willa found it both frustrating and endearing. In July, they made the trip to St. John's so Willa could see Aunt Margaret, who was walking again with the aid of a cane. Aunt Margaret took one look at Willa's rounded belly and burst into tears of joy. "A baby," she kept saying, touching Willa's stomach with reverent hands. "Oh, my dear girl, I am so happy for you." They stayed for a week, and during that time, Aunt Margaret and several of the other women in town made clothes for the baby, tiny gowns and blankets and caps. When they left, the wagon was loaded with gifts, and Willa felt overwhelmed by the generosity and love. August brought heat and hard work as Daniel and Willa worked together to prepare for winter, putting up hay and vegetables, making repairs to the barn and fences. Willa moved more slowly now, her belly large and cumbersome, but she refused to be treated as an invalid. She worked alongside Daniel as much as she could, and in the evenings, they would sit together and talk about the baby, choosing names, making plans. "If it is a boy, I want to name him Thomas after my father," Willa said one evening as they lay in bed, Daniel's hand resting on her belly where the baby kicked and turned. "Thomas is a good name," Daniel agreed. "And if it is a girl, Margaret after my aunt, if that is all right with you." "It is perfect." Daniel kissed her temple. "Boy or girl, this child is going to be so loved." The baby came early, in the first week of December during a cold snap that left ice crusted on the windows. Willa woke before dawn with pains gripping her belly, and Daniel immediately rode out for Mrs. Patterson, who had agreed to come help when the time arrived. She came quickly, bringing with her another woman from town who had experience as a midwife. The labor was long and hard, and there were moments when Willa thought she could not do it, that the pain was too much. But Daniel stayed with her, holding her hand, wiping her face with cool cloths, murmuring encouragement. And finally, as the winter sun sank toward the horizon, she heard a thin, angry wail, and the midwife placed a squirming, red-faced baby boy in her arms. "Thomas," Willa whispered, looking down at her son in wonder. He had a shock of dark hair and eyes that would probably be gray like his father's, and he was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Daniel knelt beside the bed, touching the baby's tiny hand with one finger, and Thomas's fingers curled around it reflexively. "Hello, son," Daniel said, his voice rough with emotion. "Welcome to the world." The weeks after Thomas's birth were exhausting but magical. Willa had never known she could love something so fiercely, so completely. And watching Daniel with their son, seeing the gentle way he held him, the wonder in his eyes, made her fall in love with her husband all over again. Christmas that year was quiet but perfect. Daniel cut a small pine tree and brought it inside, and they decorated it with strings of popcorn and paper ornaments. Willa made a special dinner, and they sat by the fire with Thomas sleeping in a cradle Daniel had built and counted their blessings. 2 years ago I was alone, Daniel said, holding Willa close. I thought that was just how my life would be, and now look at us. The storm brought me to you, Willa said, and you were waiting. I was waiting my whole life, Daniel agreed. I just did not know it until you fell through my door. The years that followed were full and rich. Thomas grew from a baby into a curious, energetic toddler, and then into a sturdy little boy who followed his father everywhere, wanting to help with everything. When Thomas was 3, Willa gave birth to twin daughters, Mary and Rose, who had their mother's dark hair and their father's gray eyes. The house that had once seemed so quiet was now full of noise and laughter and chaos, and Willa had never been happier. Daniel expanded the ranch, buying more land and cattle, and prospered. They were never wealthy, but they were comfortable, and they had everything they needed. Aunt Margaret came to stay for months at a time, delighting in her great nieces and nephew, and Daniel hired a young man from town to help with the ranch work. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Daniel gave Willa a beautiful necklace, a simple silver chain with a pendant shaped like a snowflake. "To remember the storm that brought you to me," he said as he fastened it around her neck. Willa touched the pendant, tears in her eyes. "I remember," she said. "I remember being so cold and frightened, thinking I was going to die. And then you opened the door and everything changed." "Best storm of my life," Daniel said, pulling her close. They stood on the porch of their home, watching their children play in the yard. Thomas was 10 now, tall and serious, helping his little sisters build a fort out of old lumber. Mary and Rose, 7 years old, were giggling and shrieking with delight. The sun was setting, painting everything in shades of gold, and Willa felt a contentment so deep it was almost a physical sensation. "We have built a good life," she said to Daniel. "The best life," he agreed. "You know what the amazing thing is? Every day I love you more than the day before. I did not think that was possible, but it is." "I know," Willa said, leaning into him. "I feel the same way." More years passed, good years and hard years, years of drought and years of plenty. Thomas grew into a strong, capable young man who took over more and more of the ranch work. Mary proved to have a head for numbers and helped her mother with the account books. Rose had inherited Willa's talent for sewing and spent hours creating beautiful things with needle and thread. When Aunt Margaret died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 85, Willa grieved deeply, but took comfort in knowing that her aunt had spent her final years surrounded by family and love. At the funeral, with Daniel's arm around her and their children close, Willa thought about how different her life might have been if she had not set out into that storm, if she had not found Daniel's ranch, if he had not opened his door. "Everything happens for a reason," Daniel said quietly as though reading her thoughts. "You were meant to find me. We were meant to be together." "I know," Willa said. "I have always known." When Thomas was 22, he married a sweet girl from town named Clara, and they built a house on the far end of the ranch property. A year later, they made Daniel and Willa grandparents with the birth of a baby girl they named Willa Margaret. Holding her namesake, looking into that tiny perfect face, Willa felt the circle complete itself in the most beautiful way. Mary married a schoolteacher and moved to Phoenix, but she visited often with her growing family. Rose shocked everyone by announcing she was going to open a dress shop in Springerville, but she proved to be a savvy businesswoman and made a success of it. She never married, claiming she was too busy, but she was clearly happy with her life, and that was all Willa wanted for her children. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Daniel took Willa on a trip back to the exact spot where she had first seen his ranch through the storm. It was summer now, the land green and lush, so different from that night in January when everything had been white and frozen. "Remember?" Daniel asked, holding her hand. "I remember everything," Willa said. "I remember thinking I was going to die. I remember seeing your light through the snow. I remember falling through your door and you catching me." "Best moment of my life," Daniel said. "The moment I knew everything was going to be different. You said you had been waiting your whole life." "I had been." Daniel turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I had been waiting for you without knowing it, waiting for the woman who would make me feel complete. Waiting for the life we would build together. And then a snowstorm brought you to my door, and everything made sense." Willa kissed him, this man who had saved her life and then given her a reason to live it fully. "I love you," she said, "more than I can ever put into words." "I love you too," Daniel said. "Every day for the rest of my life I will love you." They were not young anymore. Daniel's hair had gone gray and lines creased his face. Willa moved more slowly than she once had, her hands sometimes aching from years of sewing and ranch work. But when they looked at each other, they saw the same people who had fallen in love during a snowstorm. Two lonely souls who had found each other against all odds. They stood together looking out over the land they had built their life on, the home that had once sheltered just one lonely man and now housed generations of love and family. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant colors, and Daniel pulled Willa close. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For riding out into that storm, for finding your way to me, for saying yes when I asked you to stay, for building this life with me." Daniel's voice was thick with emotion. "For everything." Willa rested her head against his shoulder, feeling his heart beat steady and strong. "The storm brought me to you," she said, "but you made me want to stay." They walked back to the house together as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Through the windows, they could see lights glowing, could hear the sounds of their family gathered for the anniversary celebration. Thomas and Clara were there with their 3 children. Mary had come from Phoenix with her husband and 2 boys. Rose had closed the shop for the day to be present. The house was full of noise and love and life. Daniel paused at the door, the same door Willa had fallen through 25 years ago, and looked at his wife. "Ready, always," Willa said, smiling. He opened the door and they stepped inside together, into the warmth and light, into the beautiful, chaotic, loving life they had created. Their children and grandchildren called out greetings, and someone started playing music, and soon the house was full of laughter and celebration. Later that night, after everyone had gone home or to bed, Daniel and Willa sat together on the porch in the darkness, wrapped in a blanket against the cool night air. The stars overhead were brilliant, scattered across the sky like diamonds. "Do you ever think about what your life would have been like if you had not gotten caught in that storm?" Daniel asked. Willa considered the question. "Sometimes," she admitted. "I think I would have made it to St. John's eventually, would have helped Aunt Margaret recover. Probably would have gone back to Tucson and kept working at the dress shop. Maybe eventually married someone suitable and had a perfectly ordinary life." "Would you have been happy?" "I would have been content," Willa said, "but I would not have been happy, not like this. Not with this fullness in my heart that makes every day worth living." Daniel kissed the top of her head. "That storm was the best thing that ever happened to me because it brought you into my life." "You saved me," Willa said softly, "in so many ways. You gave me a home and a family and a purpose. You loved me when I did not even know I needed to be loved." "We saved each other," Daniel corrected gently. "I was just existing before you came, going through the motions. You made me start living." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the night. An owl hooted in the distance. Cattle lowed softly from the pasture. The wind whispered through the grass. "Tell me again," Willa said suddenly. "Tell me what you felt that first night." Daniel was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "I heard you knock," he said finally. "I opened the door and you fell into my arms, and I looked down at your face, so cold and frightened, and something just clicked inside me, like a key turning in a lock. Like I had been incomplete my whole life, and suddenly all the pieces fit together. I thought, this is what I have been waiting for, this woman, this moment. Everything that came before led me here so I could be the one to catch you when you fell." "I felt it too," Willa whispered. "Even though I was half frozen and terrified, I felt it, the recognition, like my soul knew yours." "Do you think we would have found each other eventually?" Daniel asked. "If not for the storm, I do not know," Willa said honestly. "But I am grateful we did not have to find out. I am grateful the storm brought me straight to your door." As if in response to her words, the wind picked up, blowing cold against their faces, and Willa pulled the blanket tighter around them. Daniel held her close, and she could feel his warmth, his strength, his steadiness. After 25 years, he was still her anchor, her home, her heart. "No regrets?" Daniel asked softly. "Not a single one," Willa said firmly. This life we have built, this family, this love, it is everything I could have dreamed of and more. You are everything I could have dreamed of and more." "Same," Daniel said simply. "You are my everything, Willa Hayes, my whole world." They stayed out on the porch until late, reluctant to end their anniversary celebration, even though it was just the two of them now in the quiet darkness. Finally, as midnight approached, they went inside and climbed into bed, the same bed where Daniel had insisted Willa sleep that first night, the same bed where their children had been conceived and born, the same bed where they had comforted each other through sorrows and celebrated joys. Daniel pulled Willa into his arms, and she rested her head over his heart, listening to its steady rhythm. This was home, she thought, not the house or the ranch or even the land. This, right here in her husband's arms, with his heart beating under her ear and his hands gentle on her back. This was home. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you," Daniel whispered back. "Today, tomorrow, and forever." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and Willa's last thought before sleep claimed her was gratitude. Gratitude for the storm that had brought her here, for the man who had opened his door, for the life they had built together one day at a time. The years continued to pass, as years do. Daniel and Willa grew older, their children grew up and had children of their own, and the ranch continued to thrive under Thomas's capable management. Daniel taught his grandsons to ride and rope and care for the cattle, passing on the knowledge he had accumulated over decades. Willa taught her granddaughters to sew and cook and manage a household, but she also taught them to be strong and independent, to trust their instincts, to never be afraid to take a chance on love. When Daniel was 58, he was thrown from a horse and broke his leg badly. The local doctor said he would likely walk with a limp for the rest of his life, and he did, but it did not slow him down much. Willa nursed him through the recovery with the same fierce devotion he had shown her during her pregnancies and illnesses, and their bond only deepened. "We have gotten old," Daniel said one evening, looking at their joined hands, both gnarled now with age and work. "We have gotten lucky," Willa corrected. "Not everyone gets to grow old with the person they love." "True." Daniel lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it. "Every wrinkle, every gray hair, every ache and pain is worth it because I got to spend this life with you." On their 30th anniversary, the family threw them a huge celebration. People came from all over, friends and neighbors and family, filling the house and spilling out into the yard. There was music and dancing and more food than Willa had seen in one place in years. At one point, looking around at all the faces, all the people whose lives they had touched and who had touched theirs, Willa felt overwhelmed with emotion. Daniel found her standing alone, tears streaming down her face, and pulled her close. "What is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong," Willa said, laughing through her tears. "Everything is so right it hurts. Look at all this, Daniel. Look at what we created. Not just our children, but this whole community of love. We did this." "You did this," Daniel said. "You brought love into my life, and it spread out like ripples in water, touching everyone around us." They danced together as the sun set, moving slowly to the music, and Willa thought about that first night when she had fallen through Daniel's door, young and frightened and alone. She had been so lost then, not even realizing how lost she was. And Daniel had been lost too, isolated by choice, convinced he was meant to be alone. But somehow, through fate or chance or divine intervention, they had found each other, and in finding each other, they had found themselves. The years continued their relentless march. Willa's hair went completely white and Daniel's limp grew more pronounced. They moved more slowly, needed more rest, but their love remained constant. Every morning, Daniel would kiss Willa and tell her she was beautiful. Every night, she would tell him she loved him. They never took a single day for granted. When Daniel was 65 and Willa 64, they decided to officially retire from ranch work and turn everything over to Thomas. He had been running things for years anyway, but there was something final about the handover, about acknowledging that their active working years were behind them. But retirement suited them. They spent their days reading and talking and sitting on the porch watching the world go by. They took trips to visit Mary in Phoenix and Rose in Springerville. They babysat grandchildren and great-grandchildren and dispensed advice when asked. One evening in January, almost exactly 40 years after the night Willa had arrived at Daniel's door, another snowstorm rolled through. It was not as severe as that long-ago blizzard, but it was significant enough that Daniel and Willa sat by the fire watching the snow swirl past the windows. 40 years, Willa said softly. 40 years since the storm brought me to you. Best storm ever, Daniel said, as he always did. He reached out and took her hand, and they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the snow and remembering. If you could go back, Willa said suddenly, and tell your younger self anything, what would it be? Daniel thought about it. I would tell him that the loneliness is not permanent. That someday, when he is least expecting it, love is going to fall through his door in the middle of a snowstorm, and his whole life is going to change. And I would tell him not to be afraid of it, not to second-guess it, just to open his heart and let it happen. What would you tell your younger self? He asked Willa. I would tell her that she is not as lost as she thinks she is, Willa said. That she is heading exactly where she needs to be, even if the path seems dark and frightening. And I would tell her to trust the cowboy who opens the door, because he is going to give her the most beautiful life she could ever imagine. They kissed as the snow fell outside, two old people still in love after 4 decades of marriage, and it felt exactly the same as that first kiss in the firelight so long ago. The passion, the connection, the sense of rightness, none of it had faded. If anything, it had only grown stronger, deepened by years of shared experience and unwavering commitment. The storm blew itself out by morning, just as that first storm had, and Daniel and Willa woke to a world transformed by white. They bundled up and walked out into it together, moving carefully on the icy ground, marveling at the beauty. The world looked new, pristine, and Willa thought about how much she still loved this place, this land, this life. Thank you, she said to Daniel as they stood looking out over the snow-covered ranch. For what? For being here. For opening your door. For waiting for me even when you did not know you were waiting. Willa turned to face him, reaching up to cup his weathered cheek. For loving me so well for so long. It has been the greatest honor of my life, Daniel said seriously. Every single day with you has been a gift. They walked back to the house hand in hand, leaving twin sets of footprints in the fresh snow, and Willa thought about all the footprints they had left over the years, all the marks they had made on the world. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, the ranch they had built, the lives they had touched, the love they had shared. It was a good legacy, she thought, a life well lived. The years continued to pass, growing shorter as years do when you age. Daniel turned 70, then 75, and though he slowed down considerably, his mind remained sharp and his love for Willa never wavered. They spent most of their time now in the house or on the porch, content to watch the world rather than participate in it as actively as they once had. Their family visited often, bringing news and laughter and the energy of youth. One spring evening when Daniel was 78 and Willa 77, they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Daniel had been quieter than usual that day, more contemplative, and Willa sensed something weighing on his mind. "What are you thinking about?" she asked gently. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "I was thinking about how lucky I have been," he said finally. "How a man who thought he would die alone ended up with the richest, fullest life imaginable. All because of a snowstorm. All because you found your way to my door." "We found each other," Willa said. "That is what matters." "I want you to know," Daniel continued, his voice serious, "that if I died tomorrow, I would die the happiest man who ever lived. You gave me everything, Willa. Everything that matters." "Do not talk about dying," Willa said, a chill running through her. "We still have years left." "Maybe," Daniel said. "Maybe not. But either way, I needed you to know. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. You turned my lonely little ranch into a home. You filled my empty heart with more love than I ever thought possible. You gave me children and grandchildren and a legacy I am proud of. Everything good in my life came from you." Tears streamed down Willa's face. "You saved my life that night. But more than that, you gave me a reason to live it. You loved me when I needed it most, and you never stopped. You are the love of my life, Daniel Hayes. My partner, my best friend, my everything." They held each other as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and purple and gold, and Willa memorized the moment. The feel of Daniel's arms around her, the sound of his heartbeat, the warmth of his body against hers. She wanted to remember everything about this perfect evening, this perfect life. Daniel lived another 5 years, dying peacefully in his sleep at the age of 83 with Willa lying beside him. She woke that morning to find him gone, his face peaceful, one hand still holding hers. The grief was enormous, a tidal wave that threatened to drown her, but underneath it was gratitude. Gratitude for every single day they had shared, for the life they had built, for the love that had sustained them both. At the funeral, the church was packed with people whose lives Daniel had touched. Thomas spoke about his father's kindness and strength. Mary talked about his gentle wisdom. Rose spoke of his unwavering support. And Willa, though she had not planned to speak, found herself standing at the front of the church with words pouring from her heart. 53 years ago," she said, her voice steady despite her tears, "I was caught in a blizzard and thought I was going to die. And then I saw a light through the snow and I rode toward it, and when I fell through the door, Daniel caught me. He caught me then, and he never let me fall again. For 53 years, he was my rock, my shelter, my home. He told me once that he had been waiting his whole life for me, and I believe that was true, just as I had been waiting my whole life for him. We were meant to find each other, meant to love each other, meant to build this beautiful life together. And even though my heart is broken now, I would not trade a single moment of the time we had. He was the love of my life, and I was blessed beyond measure to be his." After the funeral, after everyone had gone home and Willa was alone in the house that suddenly felt enormous and empty, she went to their bedroom and pulled out the silver snowflake necklace Daniel had given her on their 10th anniversary. She fastened it around her neck and held the pendant in her palm, remembering the storm, remembering the moment she had fallen through Daniel's door and into his arms, remembering the look on his face when he said he had been waiting his whole life. "I found you," she whispered to the empty room. "And you found me. And we had our whole lives together. Thank you, my love. Thank you for everything." Willa lived for another 7 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of them pieces of the love she and Daniel had created. She told stories about the old days, about the storm and the ranch and the life they had built together. She made sure the younger generations knew how their family had started, with a snowstorm and a lonely cowboy and a woman who was brave enough to ride into the unknown. When Willa died at the age of 84, she died peacefully, her hand clutching the silver snowflake pendant, and her last thought was of Daniel. She could see him in her mind's eye, young and strong, opening the door and catching her as she fell, looking at her with those storm-gray eyes and saying he had been waiting his whole life. She was buried beside him on a hill overlooking the ranch, and the entire family gathered for the funeral. Thomas, now in his 60s, spoke about his mother's strength and love. Mary and Rose talked about how she had taught them to be brave and independent and true to themselves. And the grandchildren and great-grandchildren spoke about the stories she had told them, about the romance that had started their family, about the kind of love that lasts a lifetime. Years later, one of the great-grandchildren, a girl named Willa after her great-grandmother, stood on the porch of the old ranch house and listened to her grandfather Thomas tell the story. "Your great-grandmother was caught in a blizzard," he said, "and she found her way to this house. When she fell through that door, your great-grandfather caught her, and he looked at her and said he had been waiting his whole life. And they fell in love right then and there, and 2 days later they got married. They were married for 53 years, and every single day they loved each other more. That is the kind of love you should wait for, the kind that feels like coming home." Young Willa looked up at her grandfather with wide eyes. "Do you think I will find a love like that?" Thomas smiled and ruffled her hair. "If you are brave enough to ride into the storm, who knows what you might find?" The ranch continued through the generations, each one adding to the legacy that Daniel and Willa had started. The story of the snowstorm and the lonely cowboy became family legend, told and retold until it took on an almost mythical quality. But at its heart, it remained a simple truth, that sometimes when you are lost and frightened and alone, the universe conspires to bring you exactly where you need to be. That love can strike like lightning, quick and fierce and life-changing. That opening your heart to someone, letting them in despite fear and uncertainty, is the bravest and best thing you can ever do. And on snowy winter nights, when storms rolled across the land, the descendants of Daniel and Willa Hayes would sit by their fires and think about their ancestors, about the night a blizzard brought a woman to a lonely cowboy's door, about the love that bloomed in the warmth of that first firelight and lasted a lifetime. They would think about how 2 lonely souls had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful that echoed through generations. The story ended the way all the best love stories do, with a legacy of love that outlasted death, with proof that true love is real and powerful and worth every risk. Daniel and Willa Hayes had found each other in a snowstorm and created a love that warmed everyone it touched, a love that proved that sometimes, when you least expect it, fate will bring you exactly what you have been waiting for your whole life.